My topic is about supporting reflective writing in the disciplines, and it relates to Deb's discussion about reflection earlier on, and also to Vittoria and Caroline's discussion about collaboration, I think. And there are several sessions later on which relate to this idea of supporting academic writing, academic literacies in disciplines. Um, I've uploaded the slides to a website there, and I've given you a convenient address. I hope to look it up on tinyearl.com, supporting reflective writing. And there's my email as well, in case you want to follow up with any queries. Okay, so everyone hearing me okay after that preamble? Let's kick it off. So this is what I'm hoping to cover in the next 40 minutes. I won't read all those words out. You can just have a quick look for a moment. What I'm really hoping to talk about here is just to give you an example of a piece of supporting academic writing within a couple of courses, and then maybe raising some issues possibly regarding boundaries and expertise, which I think are sort of perennial issues in our profession. So I'm working here at Massey University, one of New Zealand's universities. I'm sure you'll be very aware of the type of context which we work in as a modern university. I feel that a growing number of courses are introducing academic writing, broadly part of the move towards a more vocational focus. Here on the campus, we have nursing, social work, engineering. I work, and I'm going to refer to a speech and language therapy program, and any number of other programs, particularly in business maybe, where some more traditional written assignments are being replaced by reflective journals, which are based on either an actual placement which students are on, or on students remembering some experience that they've had. For example, that's the case with one of the postgraduate leadership assignments that I work on. I think the first issue I want to talk about is what we mean by reflective writing, and I'm going to use the metaphor of buildings to try and demonstrate how I feel about the difference and why it's a challenge for students. So if we start off with kind of the default, the classic kind of writing that we associate with universities, we have the essay. And this is a building. When I was a teacher in London, I used to often take students on visits to some of these institutions, and in those days they all had visitor centres. Now they closed them all down for security reasons, but we used to take the students in this building. It's the Bank of England, and for me it's representative in some way of what the essay is supposed to be. Okay, this classical form, and like the building itself, I think an essay is supposed to have this harmonious structure. It's static. If you look at that building, you can see nothing going on. It's all hidden. And I think as well with the essay, it's supposed to be sort of a final outcome of a process of thinking. And by the time you sit down to write the essay, there's an expectation that you've finished off agonizing and wondering, and you're ready to present that sort of polished argument. And the other thing about that building is it's strong. It presents its best face forward. And again, it's this aspect of it being complete. You are able to present an argument which is finished and therefore coherent and persuasive. Okay, so that is, in a sense, where we're coming from in terms of our ideal for academic writing. Reflection, I think, in some ways is the other side of the coin, or the extreme version. And this is another building we used to go and take groups of students to, and we used to go up that elevator there and sort of stare out at goings on the floor. And it's the Lloyd's building in London, and I mean, it's quite a different structure, and it's considered, part of the postmodern movement in architecture. And I think that in some ways reflective writing, is a sort of postmodern turn in our topic of writing and study. It's not harmonious. I mean, it's damned ugly as a building, all things sticking out. It's discordant. And there's a lot going on. It's not still. It's not polished and complete. It gives an impression of the building as a dynamic process, emergent and in the process of construction. It almost looks like it's still being built. And I think that's how reflective writing is supposed to come across, as busy and emergent, and there might be some threads that go nowhere, but then it gets picked up again, which would be considered inappropriate in an essay. And the other thing about it is it's vulnerable, because it's a kind of inside-out structure. You see, the classical building defends itself. It surrounds itself with this solid marble wall, and its inner workings are protected. But this postmodern building puts them all on the outside, and it's almost like that famous saying by Iago in Othello, where he says, should I wear my heart on my sleeve for doors to peck at? And reflective writing is like that. It introduces a kind of vulnerability, because you're externalizing your process of wondering, your doubts, your hesitations. So it's a much more vulnerable form of writing, I think, than essays. So it's no trivial matter to transfer from this traditional kind of writing to asking students to do reflective writing. And that brings me on to the idea that apart from these general features of reflective writing, there's also a certain amount of variation which is related to the ethos, I think, of different subject areas and disciplines and professions. In some of these vocational courses, there's a somewhat narrow definition of reflection, which is to do with students essentially documenting to what extent they've achieved certain competencies which they're required to demonstrate as part of their professional accreditation. Okay, and this is an example from quite an important ongoing assignment within speech and language therapy that's connected to their clinical practice paper. And as you can see, for each range of practice, you reflect on your competency development. And essentially, the competencies are predetermined principles which you then need to use as a yardstick to measure your progress. Okay. Um, Another broader interpretation of reflection is related very closely to the idea of critical thinking, which, after all, is one of those buzzwords around universities and often appears in some way in graduate attributes or um, uh, learning outcomes of particular courses. Um, and it's related to a definition by Dewey, which I've included in full in the Word handout. This is an example of a management assignment for which I've prepared some of the materials that you're going to see later. But as you can see, in this case, the lecturer's asked them to recall what he calls vignettes. He's got almost entirely international students in this paper, from India. The last year, there were India, Burma, Iraq, Iran, China, etc. And none of them knew what a vignette was. I mean, it's no one knows. I mean, it was unclear why he chose that word. Anyway, what he meant was he wanted them to recall some incidents of leadership and then to apply some kinds of theory to the to analyze the experiences. But in this case, those are not predetermined authoritative principles in the profession. They're theories in a highly contested field. So students are expected to approach them and apply them in a far more measured and critical way. Going even broader, you can say that reflection ought to include a kind of wholeness of your development as a person and professional. So that includes an opportunity to process the affective nature of experience as well. And this has been very much the case in professions such as social work. Here's the journal from the Masters of Applied Social Work program. I've highlighted there include personal thoughts, impressions, questions, struggles. I mean, this is getting very much Dear Diary, isn't it? And you'll be evaluated on your personal growth. That's a long way from what we saw in the earlier definitions of reflection. So you've got a much broader scope. Okay, so this idea that reflection can be interpreted differently, and in particular in terms of a narrow sort of competency basis or critical thinking interpretation or this holistic interpretation of personal growth, kind of feeds into the idea about why it might be problematic to ask students to write reflective accounts that are going to be assessed. So obviously lecturers may not realize that asking students to reflect is an ambiguous instruction. And as you might also imagine, they may not appreciate the complexity of reflective discourse. And I'm going to return to that a bit later. And in addition, I think in particular in relation to reflective writing, there's a reluctance to provide a lot of guidance, in particular in the form of models, partly because they feel that it might cramp the student's style, that reflection is idiosyncratic, it's personal, and so it should come out of the students rather than being based on some kind of external model. Sometimes if they do give a model, I found it very unhelpful particularly from the perspective maybe of international students who I'm working with. Very often the lecturer is going to choose an A or A plus example, which is often written by a local domestic student, for example, in management, and tends to be very highly colloquial. And the content as well is something which the students can't really relate to. So it ends up kind of making them feel disempowered rather than being something that's going to assist them in constructing their own reflective account. I worked with one particular um, management lecturer on one of these projects, and this is what he had to say about it. There's nothing to talk about. I think is a very clear expression of a certain point of view, um, which is not informed by uh, a knowledge of discourse and discourse analysis and how we learn, how we are acculturated into certain discourses. It's the idea that uh, this writing would just pour out of the students and then it can be kind of shaped. Anyway, he had a very how should I say? He was fairly strong in his belief on that point, but at the same time, quite amenable to me going in and providing a more structured account. And that's why it was made for a very interesting relationship, I think. He felt that I had a different role, a different perspective. He was very happy with me providing the sort of structured, scaffolded help that he himself felt it was inappropriate to give. Okay. Um, so anyway, I'll try and come back to that later on, but I think it raises questions about the relationship that we might have with certain topic specialists and the feasibility of in some way handing over the support that we've developed to academic staff to carry on with. Students are less likely to have had any training in reflective writing. There's no reflective writing in IELTS, for example, and what happens therefore, I think, is that in being asked to do reflective writing, students end up defaulting to a kind of writing that they're much more familiar with. Yes, and I think the point that Simon's making there is very, very relevant as well. I think it's sort of related a little bit to my next point here, which is that discomfort in exposing. Go back to that Lloyd's building picture, that, I'm putting all of my vulnerable parts on the outside. And that is also like the pictures of the two buildings. It's culturally um, related to people's cultures and expectations about what they'll do within the boundary, if you like, of academic work. And so here's one of the students in that course talking about his experience in talking to the lecturer about this issue. Do whatever you want. Yeah, the thing is, he didn't really want them to do whatever they wanted because, he I think did have an idea about some of the qualities that he was looking for. After all, he was going to assess it. It'd be fine, wouldn't it, asking students to do whatever they wanted, but if they're being assessed on that performance, I think it's a lot to ask. You're asking students to really, like Iago, I'm going to wear my heart on my sleeve, and I'm going to trust that I'm not going to get pecked. Um, Okay, so anyway, that's the sort of the context in which I've approached some of these uh, collaborations in terms of developing reflective writing. But as has already emerged, as we all know, every relationship that you have with the staff, with another staff member, is unique. Okay, and that this is a very particular lecturer with particular values and approaches, um, and others rather different. So in terms of going in here, I'm trying to fill this gap. I'm trying to provide a structure. So what I've based it on is a framework for um, reflection. Yeah, Margaret, that's very, very, very neat way of putting it. Um, so I felt that I wanted a structure that I could use because I wasn't getting anything from the lecturer and the discipline itself. And what I've based it on is quite. When you look at descriptive reflective writing, there are a number of models available, but several of them have this kind of three-part structure. So one aspect is that it's descriptive. I mean, after all, we expect students to be able to summarize key aspects about the experience which the reflection is based on. Then the next step is for them to problematize the experience. In other words, to identify questions, gaps, possibly contradictions in their knowledge at the time. And that's where the vulnerability issue comes in. And I felt that unless students are really shown there and given space to do that, it gets missed out. So that brings me to the idea of having a paragraph for each one of these levels, which is where I've gone with developing my exemplar. And then the next sort of elusive level, often called critical, is where students then attempt to use theory or principles to solve or to address those questions and gaps and contradictions that have come up in their analysis. So there's a kind of logical flow going on here. And as part of that, arguably as part of that critical reflection, that then turns into relevant goals for the next stage or for the future, which is related to that sort of experiential learning cycle that I think people are familiar with. Kolb, I think, was the main character who developed that, and it's also related to an action research cycle, essentially, and very familiar to all of us involved in education. Okay. Um, So, this is how I went about it. I think that we've all been through this sort of structure. Vanessa's just next to me, and she's been involved in doing embedded writing support in nursing and engineering, and we've all been through this first stage, maybe, of trying to find out what's going on here. So, um, uh, lecturers generally were not very available to have these in-depth conversations, so I ended up just reading about the topic. Fortunately, in one of these cases, there are a lot of readings available on the learning management system for the paper, so I ended up reading quite a lot of this in order to get an idea of the discipline and to come up with an exemplar. I ended up writing my own from scratch. Now that's not something that I think probably everyone's going to do, but I just found that the examples which I saw of student writing were not didn't lend themselves to the kind of exemplars and frameworks that I was looking for. I was looking for something which would give students a structure that they could work with and that would have imitable elements. Essentially, elements that students could use to scaffold their own accounts. And so I decided it's going to be easiest if I wrote my own from scratch, and then I could load them with the kinds of features that I thought would be helpful for students to help them to include those forms of reflection. And then, based on that earlier Vittoria and Caroline's discussion about collaboration, you try and negotiate what you can get. And sometimes it ends up being an hour in in a in a lecture or tutorial time. Sometimes you manage to get the students to come in at a lunchtime or to do something online. And but in one case, the lecturer was so keen on me doing this, the guy who said there's nothing to talk about, um, actually arranged for me to have 5 one-hour workshops in the space of a single 12-week course. I mean, it's quite a bit. Um, And in those workshops, anyway, depending on the time available, I tended to use the exemplars that I wrote for various kinds of comprehension tasks, then moving to a focus on formal elements that students could perhaps pick up, and then to allow them to have some time to discuss their own ideas and to plan their own accounts. Okay, so it's very much a typical sort of teaching learning cycle. I found with the international students that it worked quite well if we did a bit of brainstorming about what reflection was. And then I read out bits of my exemplar as a kind of oral comprehension. So I just asked them to say, well, what was this situation? What happened here? And then I just read out my first paragraph and then get the students to talk about it, maybe read it again, and then I'd say, okay, so what were the 4 or 5 parts of this story? Listen again. Can you identify the different parts of this story? Read it again, maybe once or twice, and then they'd break it down into essentially, situation, problem, response, outcome, evaluation, and so, there was quite a lot of recycling of this exemplar before they even saw it in the written form, and students were actually very positive about that. They enjoyed listening to it. Anyway, in the next 3 slides, I've just given you one exemplar that I wrote for a management paper. It's also included in the handout with some other stuff. As you can see here, I've written this in order to include the descriptive part of reflection in a single paragraph. Okay? And that paragraph has to show these 5 elements of narrative structure. Okay? So, opening situation, which is essentially the first 3 sentences there, and then problem, which is the next couple of sentences, then sort of outcome and response, outcome, and that last sentence, that last mini sentence is intended to be a short evaluation. So anyway, by the time we've gone through that, students, I think, have got an idea that part of a reflective account is essentially telling a story, and you've got to be concise, and you've got to try and include several of those elements in your paragraph. One reason to get that in a single paragraph is to avoid the common problem of students just going into storytelling mode for the whole of the account. So here, it's all done in the first paragraph. And then the second paragraph was this idea of problematizing the experience. Okay, so I've tried to load it with a couple of expressions that I thought would be helpful for students to write their own accounts. So I've included two rhetorical questions. I've included the expression, "it made me wonder." Because I think if students were going to write something and they began a sentence with, "this made me think," "this made me wonder," they're in analytical mode. So it's a very useful sentence frame for this particular purpose. Okay, so that was a paragraph which I was not seeing in any of the examples which I was provided with. And I think it's quite interesting here because essentially I'm sort of inventing a kind of writing based on this model of reflection, but largely speaking, I'm sort of inventing it. I thought, well, rhetorical questions would be good there. And that then gives me the third paragraph, which I'm calling critical, and this is where I'm trying to bring in some of the theories which I've read about because I had a good read through the stuff on this course website, and then to include a couple of goals. So again, I'm loading it with a few imitable expressions like I'm proposing, I'm offering, I need to, da. Okay. Anyway, so that was the exemplar that I came up with for a particular management course. And if you look at the handout there, I also wrote a rubric for the lecturer, sort of to try and ensure that what I was asking the students to do was going to match up with the way it was going to be assessed. And again, clearly there, I'm going outside my remit because I'm not an academic developer. I'm not really supposed to be in the role of, essentially writing an important part of the assessment for a lecturer and sort of showing lecturer how to write an assessment rubric. But I think that you may want to say something about that, but I think that a lot of us feel that we work within fairly flexible boundaries, and as long as we've got our eye on the goal of supporting and enhancing student learning, that we can kind of we can kind of move outside working solely with students in order to achieve that. Anyway, that's what happened in relation to this particular assignment, and I found that working with reflective writing, the lecturers are much more amenable to you going in and really sorting out this area, because for them I think that that they haven't really given it a lot of thought. It's ironic, really, isn't it? Because they're dealing with reflection, but unreflectively, I think, in many cases. Okay, so I did some focus groups with students in the course, and I also interviewed this lecturer as well, so I've got a bit of feedback, generally pretty positive. After all, they weren't getting anything before, so it's got to be better than that. What interested me, though, in particular, I think, was the fact that the students were perfectly happy with the lecturer's general approach, and they could perceive very clearly that we had different goals and our methods were appropriate for our role and our goal. So, of course, as someone doing learning support, I was going to be more supportive and provide more explicit guidance. And of course, as this lecturer of the contested field of management, he wasn't. And generally, I was kind of interested that the students who spoke to me in interviews in the focus group were okay with that. Um, um, They appreciate the fact that I began to know more about their subject, and they felt, therefore, my advice, even in one-to-one tutorials, if they came, sorry, consultations, was going to be more credible because I knew what they were supposed to be doing, and I began to know a bit more about management. And they also enjoyed the fact that I was sort of going through the process that they were going through because I was also, reading the stuff. I wasn't a management expert, and I was writing the stuff with them, if you like. Again, it begs the question about whether some of what I was doing might equally have been done by a past mentor or something like that. Um, the lecturer again was very opposed to that idea. He felt that there wasn't anyone who he'd trust, and that he wanted someone who was actually an expert on writing, and he didn't feel that it would be an appropriate role for a peer mentor anyway. Mm. Um, Again, the students perceived very clearly who was the person who had the upper hand in this relationship, if you like, who was the person who was actually going to mark their work. And there was a certain concern among some students that I would be singing off the same hymn sheet as the lecturer. And finally, here was the lecturer's summary about, I put to him the idea that, I prepared the materials, I've sort of set this up. How about incorporating some of that into the course itself? You could be doing this. And it's interesting because, again, he's in a sense deferring to my expertise as someone who knows about writing and discourse and is the appropriate person to do these. And again, I think it this sort of, and he's not putting me down in any way, um, but he sees a kind of complementarity between us, and I think it does uh, raise questions about this ideal that has been held in our profession about the idea of embedding support and then being able to walk away because that support has now become part of the curriculum. But in this case, the lecturer doesn't see himself as the right person to be, as the best person to be delivering this kind of support. And as it happened, I then did go back the following year and did a second iteration of this support, and ended up being recommended to do it for another management paper, which I think we know that that's the way things go. Okay, so look, I've got brief conclusions here. We're up to 40 minutes. I'm going to get kicked out of my room in about 10 minutes or so, so I'd better get to the conclusion. I'm about done. So I've, as I said at the beginning, those materials are there in the handout. You've got the slides online, and if you'd like to discuss any questions for the next 5 minutes or so. I noticed the chat as being noticeably quiet during my presentation. Is that me? Is it the time of day? Just maybe just I'll wind down a bit, create a bit of space for talking. Yeah, Simon, this particular lecturer who has been talking is unusual in the sense that he's a qualified teacher. Places great emphasis on his teaching role. So he's not one of these people who just won't, who just wants to offload stuff necessarily. But I feel that he feels his role as a postgraduate management lecturer is to disturb students' understanding, to be disruptive, if you like. And it's based on his view of management and his deeply held beliefs. So I think that's part of his reluctance to take on this sort of teaching, which might confuse the students. Because anyway, so and I think some lecturers may feel that they do have this role, this sort of disruptive role, particularly maybe at postgrad level, and it might interfere with their sense that they can be the supported, scaffolding sort of teacher as well. Now I feel that, yeah, I feel it would be good, but I can understand why the teacher has that view, and I think it's a principled position, and it's his course. By the way, we haven't had that sort of approach across other disciplines, and I think Vanessa, who I can see is typing now, has been working with nursing staff, and I feel that they do, possibly again because of their professional ethos, they take a different view, and they're very amenable to both having learning consultants coming in, but also doing some of that work themselves. So there's much more of a kind of continuity between the approaches. So I think in those cases, the topic specialists, let's say, may be very amenable to adopting some of our practices. But I think there may be disciplinary issues and issues of ethos and epistemology that might cause quite principled resistance to certain teaching staff adopting some of our practices, which we feel are consistent with what we know about discourse and how learners acquire academic literacies. But again, some lecturers may feel that's not their role anyway. Yeah, thanks, Vanessa, and that's a very good point. And I think that all of us have found, for example, doing these workshops has increased the uptake. I've been involved with the speech and language therapy program over a period of years now. And when I started, very little engagement with our centre. Very few students would ever come, mostly because they'd been told they had to come and they're a bit reluctant. But during the last year, I had about 50 consultations with speech and language therapy students, so it can have this quite transformative effect on the perception of the centre and the use of the centre. When I was talking to the speech and language therapy students in focus groups, one of them, there was a really great focus group I had with them, and they were saying it reminds us of the remedial service at school, you know, and you'd only go there if you couldn't learn well. And I think that I can understand why they think like that. Um, yes, there was a real stigma for some of those people, and it was related, I think, to them identifying us as the people in sort of high school or secondary school, and people who you wouldn't want to be have to go along to because you know other students might look down on you for it. Okay, everyone. So I'm about done, and I know there's a couple of people going to write something. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but we've got our little chirpy little song telling us that we have to leave the centre in 15 minutes. I'm going off to see a production of King Lear later on, so I just hope they play it for laughs. You know, summer evening entertainment over here in Auckland. Um, Yeah, Ali, by the way, the workshops I gave, the lecturer actually sat in on two of these workshops and was together with the students doing the tasks, etc. And I think that did have the effect of showing the students anyway that there was a value in what I was doing and, if you like, bigging up my expertise in terms of teaching academic writing. Yeah, I mean that issue of stigmatization, I think, is just a long ongoing one, and I think it's our sort of rolling up, rolling the stone up the mountain overnight, and then getting up again, and getting down the bottom and pushing up the top again, and knowing that you'll do the same tomorrow. You know, that's what it's like. That's our remedial stone, and it's got gravity. It keeps wanting to fall down to the bottom, and we have to keep, you know, getting up again and pushing it up where it belongs, you know? So look, if any of you want to adopt some of that material, just let me know how it goes. And it's all work in progress. I'm hoping to write up an article on this topic at some point, and generally to write up some things on the topic of sort of integrated learning and writing support during the next year. So, you know, any more feedback you can give me on that issue would be really very welcome. And thank you, Margaret. Yeah, and I really feel that this area of reflective writing has great potential for us to move into, partly because it's a growing field. Um, it's related to this vocational turn, which makes it seem uh, particularly valued, I think, within the tertiary sector as it is at the moment. And it's an area where our help is, I think, very much appreciated, because I think the range of staff, they realise that they may not have written reflectively back when they were students. It's not like a lit review or an essay where they may feel that it's something that everyone should be able to do. I think they very readily recognise that something's needed,